The cruelest people are not the ones who hate you. They are the ones who smile while stripping away your dignity in front of everyone. The laughter echoed across the bright marble lobby of Redwood Capital Group just after 8:30 on a Monday morning. Employees carrying coffee slowed their steps. Assistants stopped beside the security gates. Even the receptionists glanced up from their monitors. Everyone sensed something uncomfortable was unfolding, yet no one moved to stop it. Victoria Hayes stood quietly near the visitor check-in desk, wearing a navy blazer, black slacks, and carrying nothing more than a leather portfolio. She had arrived 10 minutes early for what everyone believed was an orientation meeting for an outside consultant. She looked calm, composed, almost invisible among the flood of executives rushing through the revolving doors. Then Madison Clark's voice sliced through the lobby. "Well, look who decided to come back." Several heads turned immediately. Madison walked across the polished floor in designer heels, her confident smile growing wider with every step. She wrapped one arm around Logan Pierce, who had just entered through the executive entrance, as though she wanted every employee to see exactly where she belonged. Logan glanced toward Victoria. His expression barely changed. No surprise, no warmth, just cold recognition, followed by indifference. Madison laughed softly before speaking louder. "I thought consultants were supposed to use the employee entrance." A few nervous chuckles spread through the crowd. Victoria met her eyes, but said nothing. Madison tilted her head. "Or did you forget how things work around here after the divorce?" The room grew quieter. Logan adjusted the cuff of his expensive suit and checked his watch instead of looking at Victoria. His silence landed harder than Madison's words. Victoria had once walked these same halls beside him while they built presentations late into the night, celebrated impossible deals, and dreamed about what Redwood could become. Back then, people had called them the company's golden couple. Now, most of the younger employees barely recognized the woman standing alone near reception. Madison stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. "Actually," she said with a bright smile, "since you're only temporary, why don't you make yourself useful? The executive conference room needs fresh coffee before the board meeting." Several employees looked away, embarrassed. One young analyst quietly shook his head, but he stayed silent like everyone else. Victoria slowly lowered her eyes to Madison's company badge before looking back up. Her voice remained even. "Is that an official assignment?" Madison folded her arms. "Do you really think you're in a position to ask questions?" Logan finally spoke without meeting Victoria's eyes. "Some people never learn when it's time to leave." The sentence landed like ice water. No anger, no hesitation, just quiet dismissal from the man who had once promised to stand beside her through every success and every failure. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. There was sadness there, but not the kind that begged for another chance. It was the sadness of someone realizing a chapter had truly ended years ago. She simply nodded once. "I understand." Madison smirked, believing she had won. Around them, whispers began traveling across the lobby. Poor woman. She came back for this? What was she thinking? Victoria neither defended herself nor walked away. She stood perfectly still, watching the elevator display count downward from the top floor. Ding! The private executive elevator opened. A distinguished gray-haired man stepped out first, followed by 6 members of Redwood Capital's board of directors. Before anyone could react, Victoria's phone vibrated once. She glanced at the screen. The message contained only 5 words. "The board is ready, Madam CEO. De la Part 2, Teep Noi Truck Teep Part 1 Va Jung Nguyen Nan Vat, Boi Can, Mok Trian." The words on Victoria's phone disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, but she did not need to read them twice. She slipped the phone back into her portfolio and lifted her eyes toward the board members walking across the lobby. None of them acknowledged her yet. That was intentional. Everything had to happen in the right order. Madison noticed the group approaching and immediately straightened her jacket. Perfect timing, she whispered to Logan with a confident smile. "They are about to see exactly why I belong here." Logan gave a small nod. "Just keep this professional." Madison laughed under her breath. "Professional?" She showed up looking like she still thinks this place owes her something. Victoria heard every word. Years ago, those comments would have cut deeply. Today they felt strangely distant, like hearing strangers argue on the next table over in a restaurant. She had already survived the part of her life that truly hurt. 5 years earlier, These same floors had been filled with very different memories. Victoria had spent countless nights in conference rooms with whiteboards covered in handwritten ideas. She was the strategist. Logan was the closer. She built the financial models that attracted investors. He stood in front of the cameras and delivered the presentations. At the time, neither of them cared who received the applause. They were building a future together. Or at least, she believed they were. Everything changed after Redwood secured its largest expansion deal. Logan became a familiar face in business magazines. Invitations to charity galas, television interviews, and executive retreats followed. Somewhere along the way, the partnership inside their marriage quietly disappeared. Then Madison arrived. Young, ambitious, polished, and always ready to tell Logan exactly what he wanted to hear. Victoria never blamed another woman for the collapse of her marriage. By the time Madison entered the picture, the cracks were already there. Trust had been replaced by ambition. Conversations became negotiations. Silence lasted longer than affection. The divorce papers were signed without a dramatic courtroom fight or public accusations. Victoria simply packed 2 suitcases, removed her family photos from the house, left her wedding ring inside the top drawer of Logan's desk, and walked away before sunrise. Everyone inside Redwood assumed she had disappeared because she had nothing left. Nobody knew that while Logan focused on titles and headlines, Victoria quietly accepted an invitation from one of the country's most respected investment firms. There she spent years rebuilding more than a career. She rebuilt her confidence. She learned how billion-dollar acquisitions were negotiated behind closed doors. She earned the respect of people who cared far more about results than appearances. One successful investment led to another until an opportunity appeared that almost nobody recognized. Redwood's largest institutional shareholders were quietly looking for new leadership. Victoria listened. She invested. She waited. She never announced her intentions. She never sought revenge. She simply prepared for the day when preparation would matter more than emotion. Back in the lobby, one of the younger assistants leaned toward another employee and whispered, "Who is she really?" Before anyone could answer, one of the board members slowed his pace just enough to glance toward Victoria. His expression remained neutral, but there was unmistakable respect in his eyes. Logan noticed the brief exchange. A small crease formed across his forehead. It lasted only a second, yet for the first time that morning, certainty gave way to curiosity. Logan kept watching the board members as they crossed the lobby, but his attention kept drifting back to Victoria. Something felt off. It was not fear on her face. It was not embarrassment either. If anything, she looked like someone waiting for a train that was arriving exactly on schedule. Madison noticed his distraction and slipped her hand around his arm. "Do not tell me you suddenly feel sorry for her." Logan shook his head. "No, I just do not understand why she came back." Madison smiled. "Because people who lose everything always come back hoping someone will notice." Without another word, she turned toward Victoria. "Actually, there is one more thing you can do before you leave. The executive conference room needs fresh notebooks, bottled water, and coffee. Since you are only here as outside help, I am sure you can manage that." A few employees exchanged uneasy looks. Nobody laughed this time. The joke had already gone too far. Victoria looked at Madison with the same calm expression she had worn since walking through the front doors. "I was told to report to the executive floor." Madison folded her arms. "You report wherever I tell you to report." Logan finally stepped forward. "Madison is organizing today's meeting. Follow her instructions." The words settled over the room like a heavy weight. Several long-time employees lowered their eyes. They remembered another version of this company, when Victoria had been respected for her sharp instincts and steady leadership. Back then, Logan had introduced her as the smartest person in every room. Today, he acted as though she had never mattered. Victoria quietly nodded once. "Understood." She picked up a stack of leather meeting folders sitting neatly on the reception counter. Madison exchanged a satisfied glance with Logan. "See? That was not so difficult." As everyone headed toward the private elevators, the atmosphere changed almost instantly. Conversations became quieter. Senior executives who normally joked with one another walked in complete silence. The board members had already reached the executive floor, and everyone knew this quarterly strategy meeting carried unusual importance. Rumors had been circulating for weeks that Redwood Capital Group was preparing for major leadership changes. Inside the executive conference room, Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The long walnut table was surrounded by empty chairs, each marked with engraved nameplates. Victoria placed the folders carefully in front of every seat. She adjusted a slightly crooked chair, straightened a misplaced pen, and noticed the small red recording light glowing inside the ceiling camera. Every executive meeting was archived for governance purposes. Every word spoken in this room would become part of the company's permanent record. Madison walked around the table, inspecting everything with exaggerated confidence. "Not bad," she said. "At least you remembered how to prepare a room." Logan stood near the windows reviewing financial reports on his tablet, never once looking in Victoria's direction. His confidence came from years of believing he understood every corner of this company. He had no reason to think today would be different. Then the conference room doors opened again. One by one, the members of the board entered without speaking. Instead of taking their seats immediately, they remained standing. The oldest director glanced around the room before calmly asking, "Is everyone here?" Another director answered with a quiet smile. "We are only waiting for one person." Logan frowned. Madison looked confused. She whispered, "Who could possibly outrank the board?" Before anyone could respond, the room fell completely silent as every pair of eyes slowly turned toward Victoria. For one long second, nobody moved. The silence inside the conference room felt heavier than any argument could have. Logan followed the direction of the board's attention until his eyes landed on Victoria. He let out a quiet laugh, convinced there had to be some misunderstanding. "There must be another guest coming," he said. Madison nodded quickly. "Of course. The new chief executive officer would never." Her sentence faded before she could finish it. The chairman of the board stepped away from the table and walked directly toward Victoria. Every step echoed across the polished hardwood floor. The room watched without breathing. When he finally stopped in front of her, he smiled warmly and extended his hand. "Good morning, Miss Hayes. Welcome home." Victoria returned the handshake with calm confidence. "Good morning, Richard." "Thank you." The chairman turned toward the rest of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to formally welcome the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Redwood Capital Group." Every board member rose at once. "Good morning, Madam Chief Executive Officer." The words hit the room like thunder. Madison's tablet slipped from her hands and struck the floor with a loud crack. Logan stared at Victoria without blinking. His face drained of color. "That is impossible," he whispered. She does not." He stopped because he realized he no longer knew what to say. Victoria did not look at him. Instead, she greeted each board member by name, exchanging brief handshakes that reflected years of mutual respect rather than a newly formed business relationship. Several executives who had ignored her only moments earlier instinctively stood from their chairs. No one had asked them to. They simply understood the room had changed forever. Madison forced a nervous smile. "There has to be some mistake." Richard calmly replied, "There is no mistake. The board voted unanimously 3 weeks ago." Logan finally found his voice. Why was executive leadership not informed? Another director answered before Victoria could speak. Because confidentiality was required until today's transition meeting. Logan looked around the room, searching for support, but every face remained unreadable. The certainty that had carried him through the morning was disappearing one uncomfortable second at a time. Victoria slowly walked toward the chair at the head of the table. She placed her leather portfolio beside it, but remained standing. "Please," she said gently. "Everyone have a seat. We have important work to do." Her voice was steady, neither triumphant nor bitter. That unsettled Logan even more. He had expected anger. He had prepared himself for revenge. He had not prepared for professionalism. Madison leaned closer and whispered, "Say something. You cannot just let this happen." Logan swallowed hard. "Victoria." It was the first time he had spoken her name all morning. She finally looked at him. Her expression was composed, almost kind, but there was a distance in her eyes that had never existed during their marriage. "Yes, Mr. Pierce." The formal title landed harder than any insult. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing he could say in front of the board that would erase what everyone had witnessed downstairs. Victoria took her seat at the head of the table and opened a slim folder embossed with the company's seal. "Before we discuss the future," she said, looking around the room, "there are several decisions from the past that deserve another look." Logan felt his stomach tighten. Madison glanced nervously toward him for answers he no longer had. Neither of them realized that the first document waiting inside Victoria's folder had been quietly collecting signatures and evidence for nearly 5 years, and in just a few minutes, the room would discover that today's surprise was only the beginning. No one reached for the coffee. No one opened a laptop. The conference room remained frozen, as if everyone understood that the meeting they had expected had already disappeared. Victoria rested her hands lightly on the folder in front of her and looked around the table. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "Before we discuss where Redwood Capital Group is going, I believe we owe ourselves an honest conversation about how we arrived here." Her tone was calm, almost conversational. That made every word impossible to ignore. Logan shifted in his chair. He had sat at this table hundreds of times, usually controlling every discussion before it even began. Today he felt like a guest inside his own office. Madison tried to recover her confidence. "With all due respect, should we not focus on current business instead of personal history?" Victoria turned toward her with a polite smile. "I agree completely. This is not about personal history. It is about corporate governance." The distinction landed hard. Richard, the chairman, nodded without saying a word. Victoria opened the folder and slid several copies across the polished table. Each document carried the Redwood Archive seal. 5 years ago, she said, our strategic expansion initiative became the foundation for nearly every major acquisition this company completed afterward. Logan looked down at the report. His heartbeat quickened. He recognized it immediately. It had been one of the most celebrated projects of his career. Victoria continued. Most people remember the presentations. Very few remember who built the strategy. She tapped the first page. "Please turn to page 4. Paper quietly rustled around the room. A timeline filled the page, listing research dates, financial models, and project milestones. Every original draft was attached with digital timestamps. One of the independent directors adjusted his glasses. These models were created almost entirely by Ms. Hayes. "That is correct," Victoria replied. 92% of the financial framework came from my office." Logan finally leaned forward. "Everyone collaborated on that project." Victoria nodded. "Yes, collaboration is healthy. Misrepresentation is not." Nobody interrupted her this time. She clicked a small remote, and the large presentation screen came to life. Side by side appeared 2 documents. On the left was the original proposal carrying Victoria's digital signature. On the right was the version presented to investors weeks later. Her name had disappeared. Logan's remained. A quiet murmur spread around the table. Madison looked from one screen to the other. "There has to be an explanation." Victoria answered without raising her voice. "There is. We will get to it." She pressed the remote again. Additional documents appeared, each showing revisions, approval logs, and internal communications preserved in the company's secure archive. Every file carried verified timestamps. Nothing had been recreated. Nothing had been altered. The evidence had simply been waiting. Logan stared at the screen, memories rushing back faster than he could process them. At the time, he had convinced himself those changes were temporary. Necessary. Good for the company. Now, seeing the entire sequence laid out in front of the board, those old justifications sounded painfully hollow even inside his own mind. Victoria slowly closed the folder. "I did not come back today to embarrass anyone," she said. "I came back because leadership begins with accountability." The room fell silent again. Then Richard folded his hands and looked directly at Victoria. "Madam Chief Executive Officer, does this conclude the historical review?" Victoria met his eyes and gave a small shake of her head. "Not even close." She reached into her portfolio and carefully removed a slim black flash drive. "Because the documents explain what happened. The recordings explain who made the decisions." Logan felt the blood drain from his face as Victoria placed the flash drive gently on the conference table. And for the first time that morning, he realized the worst part of his past had not yet entered the room. The black flash drive rested in the middle of the conference table like it weighed 100 pounds. Nobody reached for it. Nobody spoke. Victoria broke the silence first. "Before anyone makes assumptions, I want to be very clear. Everything you are about to see comes from Redwood's own secure archive. Every recording was preserved according to company policy. Nothing has been edited." Richard gave a quiet nod. "Proceed." Victoria connected the flash drive to the conference room system. A list of archived meeting files appeared on the large screen, each labeled with a date, time, and verification stamp. The company's general counsel leaned forward. "The metadata has already been authenticated," she said. "These files meet our compliance standards." Logan felt his throat tighten. He recognized several of the dates immediately. They were meetings he had not thought about in years. Victoria selected the first recording. The screen filled with the image of a younger executive team sitting around the same conference table. Logan appeared on the screen, confidently presenting the strategic expansion initiative to senior leadership. As the recording continued, one board member paused it. "Who developed the financial model being presented here?" Victoria quietly opened another document. "Please compare the presentation with the original working files." Side by side, the timestamps matched perfectly. Every forecast, every market projection, and every investment strategy originated from Victoria's drafts weeks before the meeting had taken place. An independent director slowly removed his glasses. This level of analysis would have required months of work. Victoria nodded. "It did." Logan finally spoke. No one denied that she contributed. Victoria looked at him calmly. Contributing and receiving proper credit are two different things. No one challenged her. She started the second recording. This time the room heard Logan's own voice from years earlier. "Remove her name from the investor package. The leadership message needs one face." Multiple voices create confusion. A long silence followed. Logan closed his eyes for a brief moment. Hearing his own words spoken aloud in front of the board sounded far different than remembering the conversation in his own mind. Madison shifted uneasily in her chair. That could have been taken out of context. Victoria did not answer immediately. Instead, she played the next portion of the recording. Another executive asked, "Does Victoria know about this?" Logan's recorded voice replied without hesitation, "She does not need to. I will handle it." No one in the room said a word. The explanation Madison had hoped for disappeared before it could even begin. Victoria disconnected the recording and folded her hands on the table. "I am not sharing these files because I need an apology. That chapter of my life ended a long time ago. I am sharing them because trust is the foundation of leadership, and trust cannot exist without transparency." Around the table, several executives who had once admired Logan now avoided looking in his direction. Years of assumptions were quietly falling apart. Richard exchanged a glance with the general counsel before speaking. "Based on the documentation presented today, I believe the board has sufficient cause to initiate a formal governance review." Logan looked up immediately. "Richard, surely we can discuss this privately." The chairman slowly shook his head. "No, Logan. This company deserves better than private conversations." Victoria remained silent. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply watched as the consequences began unfolding on their own. Then the general counsel received a notification on her tablet. She read it once before looking toward Victoria with visible surprise. "Madam Chief Executive Officer," she said carefully, "our forensic audit team has just completed another review. They found additional files that were never included in today's presentation." Every eye turned toward her. Logan felt his pulse quicken. If the recordings had already changed everything, he could not imagine what was hidden inside the newly discovered files, and deep down, he feared those files would expose far more than anyone in that room was prepared to hear. The notification remained on the general counsel's tablet, but no one rushed to open the newly discovered files. The atmosphere in the conference room had already changed beyond recognition. Logan no longer looked like the executive who had walked into the building that morning. His shoulders were tense, and for the first time in years, he seemed unsure of what would happen next. Richard folded his hands on the table. "Before we continue, I believe we should address an immediate governance issue." He looked around the room. "Does anyone object?" No one spoke. Even the executives who had worked beside Logan for years remained silent. Victoria watched the room carefully. This was the moment she had prepared for, but not because she wanted to see anyone humiliated. She wanted the company to remember that leadership was earned through trust, not protected by titles. Richard continued, "Effective immediately, I am recommending that all executive approvals requiring Mr. Pierce's signature be temporarily suspended until the governance review is complete." The motion settled over the room like a wave. One board member after another quietly raised a hand. The vote was unanimous. Logan looked from face to face, searching for someone willing to defend him. Nobody did. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood. "Victoria, may I speak with you privately?" Every eye shifted toward her. She met his gaze without anger. "Anything you need to say can be said here." Logan lowered his voice. "Please." Victoria gently shook her head. Private conversations are exactly how important decisions stopped being transparent. The words were calm, but they left no room for negotiation. Madison finally broke her silence. "This is completely unfair. Logan built this company." Victoria turned toward her. "Many people built this company." She paused for a moment before continuing. "Some of them simply never received the recognition they earned." Madison crossed her arms. "You are making this personal." Victoria answered almost immediately. "No. Personal would have been humiliating you in front of the entire company. I have no interest in doing that. We are discussing documented business decisions." The distinction was impossible to ignore. Several executives exchanged quiet glances. They had witnessed what happened in the lobby only an hour earlier. Victoria had every opportunity to embarrass Logan and Madison after becoming chief executive officer. Instead, she had done the opposite. She stayed focused on facts. That choice quietly won over people who had not yet decided where they stood. Just then, the door opened softly. The corporate secretary stepped inside, carrying a sealed envelope. "Madam Chief Executive Officer," she said, placing it in front of Victoria. "This arrived from our external auditors 10 minutes ago. They requested that it be delivered directly to today's meeting." Victoria looked at the envelope without opening it. Were they expecting additional findings? "Yes," the secretary replied. "They said the review uncovered financial authorizations connected to projects that were never presented to the board." Logan felt his heartbeat quicken again. He knew exactly which projects they might be talking about, but he had convinced himself those records had disappeared years ago. Richard noticed the change in Logan's expression. "Do you recognize what might be inside?" Logan hesitated before answering. I am not sure." It was the least convincing sentence he had spoken all day. Victoria slowly slid one finger beneath the envelope seal, but stopped before opening it. She looked around the table one last time. "Before we continue," she said quietly, "everyone deserves to understand that what is inside this envelope will not only determine individual accountability. It may change the future ownership structure of Redwood Capital Group itself." The room fell completely silent again. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody looked away. Every person at that table understood they were no longer watching the end of an old story. They were about to witness the beginning of an entirely new one. Victoria slowly opened the envelope and removed a neatly organized stack of reports. She scanned the first page for only a moment before sliding copies toward every member of the board. "These documents came from our independent external auditors," she said. "They completed a full review before today's transition meeting. I have not asked anyone to take my word for anything. The facts can speak for themselves." Richard nodded. "Please continue." Victoria stood and walked toward the large display screen. A single chart appeared, showing Redwood Capital Group's ownership history over the last 5 years. Colored lines traced investments, institutional holdings, and voting shares. "Most employees believed I disappeared after the divorce," Victoria said. "That was understandable. I never corrected the rumors." She looked around the room before continuing. "While I was gone, I accepted a position advising one of the largest investment partnerships in the country. During that time, I quietly invested in companies I believed had long-term value." Logan stared at the screen. His expression changed as he recognized the names of several investment funds. Those funds had gradually purchased Redwood stock over the years. At the time, he had celebrated the increased market confidence without ever asking who was behind it. Victoria clicked the remote again. The ownership chart shifted. Every acquisition highlighted in blue eventually flowed into a single parent entity, Redwood Strategic Holdings. The room grew noticeably quieter. Richard folded his hands. "Please explain the relationship." Victoria answered without hesitation. 3 years ago, I became the managing partner of Redwood Strategic Holdings. Every investment made by that partnership was fully disclosed, fully regulated, and approved through the appropriate legal channels. Earlier this month, after completing the final acquisition, our partnership became Redwood Capital Group's largest voting shareholder. Logan slowly leaned back in his chair as the truth settled in. He finally understood why the board had selected Victoria. She had not been given the company. She had earned the authority to lead it. Madison shook her head in disbelief. So you planned all of this? Victoria met her eyes calmly. I plan to rebuild my life. There is a difference. The general counsel spoke next. The audit also confirms there were no conflicts of interest in these acquisitions. Every transaction complied with federal regulations and corporate policy. Madison had no response. Her confidence, so effortless that morning in the lobby, had completely disappeared. Logan looked toward Victoria again, but this time there was no frustration in his expression, only regret. Why did you never tell me? He asked quietly. Victoria gave a small, thoughtful smile. Because after our divorce, my responsibility was no longer to explain my future to you. The answer was gentle, yet it carried years of quiet strength. Richard reviewed the final pages of the audit before clearing his throat. There is one remaining recommendation. Every head turned toward him. The auditors advised that the board immediately begin reviewing executive compensation approvals, project authorizations, and leadership appointments made during the period covered by the governance investigation. Logan lowered his eyes. He understood exactly what that meant. Every decision made under his leadership would now be examined one by one. Before anyone could speak again, the corporate secretary entered the room carrying a tablet. "Excuse me," she said. "The employees have gathered outside the auditorium. They have heard that leadership changes are taking place, and they are waiting for an official statement from the new chief executive officer." Victoria glanced through the glass wall overlooking the executive floor. Hundreds of employees had already gathered below, searching for answers. She quietly closed the audit report and stood. "Then they deserve the truth," she said. Richard smiled. "I believe they also deserve to see what real leadership looks like." As Victoria walked toward the conference room doors, Logan remained seated, realizing that the next few minutes would not simply determine his career. They would reveal, in front of the entire company, the difference between authority that comes from a title and respect that must be earned. Victoria stepped onto the auditorium stage without an escort, without dramatic music, and without the kind of grand entrance many people expected from a new chief executive officer. Hundreds of Redwood employees filled the room. Others watched from overflow areas and office monitors throughout the building. The whispers stopped the moment she reached the podium. Logan and Madison remained near the back of the auditorium, saying nothing. For the first time, neither of them was the center of attention. Victoria looked across the crowd and recognized familiar faces. Some had worked beside her years ago. Others had joined after she left and knew her only through rumors. She took a slow breath before speaking. "Thank you for being here." Her voice carried naturally through the room. "Many of you have questions. You deserve honest answers." The large screen behind her displayed only the Redwood Capital Group logo. There were no photographs, no headlines, and no mention of the morning's confrontation. "Today is not about proving someone wrong," she continued. "It is about reminding ourselves what kind of company we choose to become." The room remained silent. Employees listened carefully. 5 years ago, I walked out of this building believing that my work had been forgotten. I was hurt. I was disappointed. But I also realized something important. You can spend your life chasing revenge, or you can spend your life becoming someone that revenge is no longer necessary. Several people exchanged quiet glances. Even those who knew nothing about her past understood exactly what she meant. Victoria smiled gently. "While I was away, I stopped asking who had taken credit for my work. Instead, I asked myself a different question. What kind of leader do I want to be if I ever have another chance?" She paused for a moment before continuing. "That question changed my life." She looked toward the employees standing along the walls. No one should ever feel invisible because of their position. No one should be humiliated to make someone else feel powerful. Respect is not a reward you earn after success. Respect is the minimum every person deserves the moment they walk through these doors. A wave of quiet applause began somewhere in the middle of the room before spreading throughout the auditorium. Victoria waited until the applause faded. Effective immediately, Redwood will introduce a new leadership charter focused on transparency, accountability, and recognition. Every major project will clearly identify the people who built it. Every employee will have a safe process to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. We will not measure greatness only by profits. We will measure it by character. This time the applause was louder. Logan lowered his head. Listening to Victoria speak, he finally understood what he had truly lost. It was never the title. It was never the office overlooking the city. It was the trust of the one person who had believed in him before anyone else did. Madison quietly slipped out of the auditorium without saying a word. Nobody noticed. Nobody followed. The meeting ended with employees standing to applaud, not because they had witnessed someone's downfall, but because they had witnessed the beginning of something better. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Richard walked beside Victoria and smiled. "Welcome home, Madam Chief Executive Officer." Victoria looked around the building she had once left with nothing but 2 suitcases and quiet determination. "Thank you," she replied softly. "This time, we build a company where no one has to lose their dignity to find their value." Years later, people would remember that morning for many reasons. Some would remember the unexpected leadership change. Others would remember the governance reforms that transformed Redwood Capital Group. But those who were there never forgot the simplest lesson of all. The loudest person in the room is not always the strongest. Real power does not come from taking someone else's place. It comes from becoming the kind of person who never has to take it away in the first place. And sometimes, the greatest victory is not watching the people who hurt you fall. It is standing so firmly in your own worth that their approval is no longer something you need.